Hello and welcome back to the channel. So I wanted to talk to you about literature and the soul. Is the author still alive? Is the soul still alive? Is the consciousness still alive through the imagination of the people reading their words?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one of the definitions of writing is that it's what survives. And this French philosopher who I like very much, Jacques Derrida, says writing's main function is to be what can live on without us. Even if we write a shopping list, the idea is we've put down on paper something that then sort of exists independently of us and doesn't need us there to stay with it. The shopping list is there. And in fact, the shopping list continues even after we die, as long as we don't throw it away. So there's something about writing which is already surviving the author, lives on after the author. So there's that philosophical notion of the writing living on. Does the author live on in the writing? Does the soul of the author live on in the writing? That's a bit more hard to prove. And even to say the intention of the author lives on after they've passed away or left the writing behind is contentious, because even if I were to write something down, something like eats, shoots and leaves, if you remember the name of that famous book about punctuation, it can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. Eats can be a noun, it can be a verb, and the same with shoots and leaves. Eat shoots and leaves. She eats, she shoots, she leaves. Or these eats as in food, and so on. So the intention of the author isn't necessarily there even at the moment that they're writing, or isn't the only thing that determines the text. And you can interpret it something differently. I can write your WhatsApp message and you can misinterpret it right there and then, even though I think I'm being perfectly clear in my intention about it. So the intention is already a bit fragile. And I can write something down and make a mistake. I can make not just a spelling mistake, I might even write something down that I didn't mean to write down at all in the first place. So the intention isn't really a guarantee of what's going to go into the text itself. So if a text doesn't even necessarily bear the intention of its author, I think even harder to say that literature as a more formal or innate, or at least culturally significant form of writing, can somehow bear the soul of its literary author after the author has died. So I think my short answer to the question is no, the soul of an author is not present in the text, and the soul of an author is not present in the imagination of the reader, which is part of your question. But when I was thinking of Shakespeare as you were talking, because Shakespeare often, particularly in his sonnets, refers to the way in which the sonnets will live on after his death, as though they're kind of monumental, even though he's writing them in the late 16th century and they're circulating and maybe finding their way to court and among other writers and so on, that they are already capable of that length of surviving. And the fact we're even still talking about Shakespeare obviously proves the point, doesn't it? 500 years later, we're still speaking of him. But does that mean Shakespeare's lived on? Well, it depends what you mean by Shakespeare, because when we say Shakespeare, what we're typically referring to is the oeuvre, the collected works, but even then only in a fairly schematic way. We're not really thinking about every line from Henry IV Part 1 or As You Like It or The Tempest. We've got a general idea of what we mean by Shakespeare, almost like a brand. And that's, what's living on.
Shakespeare's an interesting one because we don't know anything about Shakespeare, the person, do we? Apart from some wills and stuff like that. So we only have his work to go by.
Well, we have, there are biographies of Shakespeare. We know where he grew up. We know what his, parents did. We know he was in London as well as Stratford. We know he was an actor. We know he was a businessman as well. There's evidence for him having homosexual relationships. So, we know a fair.
Yeah, that's
It's
true.
not a
Okay, I
comprehensive
take it back.
account. But does his soul live on in his work? I don't. I think it's hard to say. And I think particularly because most of his work is dramatic work written through characters. So he's not writing in the first person. He's not, in most cases, saying, I, William Shakespeare, this or that. The sonnets perhaps would appear to be the closest thing that we have to a voice of Shakespeare, writing them or not. But even then, there are all sorts of questions about the relationship between an author and the narrative voice in a text, and whether either could claim to be the soul of a piece of writing. So I don't think a piece of writing has a soul. My definition of the soul is that which is capable of expanding its consciousness. Well, I don't think a piece of writing is capable of expanding its consciousness. There's a spirit, to Shakespeare's works. There's a feeling to it. And there's something in the fact that it can be remembered, recited, more productions can be made of the same play, which suggests a kind of, that it's perhaps like all literature, a sort of infinite resource. It's happened in the case of Shakespeare. It could happen in the case of a lesser writer. And to that extent, any piece of writing that survives empirically can always be interpreted again and again. So it's probably more accurate to say that interpretations live on. There's an after, insofar as a piece of writing can be infinitely interpreted, not just in the moment, but over time, and adapted to a new context and reinterpreted and so on, there's a case for saying that there is a sort of implicit longevity to any piece of writing, because it can be retold and reenacted and so on. To that extent, I suppose you could say there's kind of a soul, but I'd say that's the soul of interpretation.
Have you seen that movie Anonymous? The premise is that Shakespeare isn't really Shakespeare, that the real Shakespeare was a rich lord and that someone else took the fame and glory. But I do remember a scene when someone calls him, like, you're the soul of the age. So that's kind of interesting,
Yeah, it is. And, there are lots of theories about who wrote Shakespeare. There's a book called Who Wrote Shakespeare? Francis Bacon, Earl de Vere, and so on. The soul of the age. There's also this phrase, the spirit of the age, which is a translation of the German term Zeitgeist, which I think is slightly different, but it sort of says that each age kind of has a defining set of characteristics. So the age of the Enlightenment, for example, would be the age of reason, science, experimentation, light, enlightenment, kind of metaphorically as well as literally. Again, though, I'd say that the word spirit is probably better suited to that. What the word in German is Geist, which is a much more complex word, really. The soul of the age, the spirit of the age. These are just my definitions. There's no final answer on this, Was Shakespeare the soul of his age? I don't know. You could argue that in a way he was fairly untypical, because he was playing with literature in different ways. He was messing up genres. He was mixing tragedy with comedy. He was writing for the court, but also being a little bit subversive. I don't know. It's also a bit of a generalization to say that an age has a spirit, because you have to discount so many things. It was in the first Trump presidency, it was said we're now in the age of post-truth. you know, we're in the post-truth era, as though that was the spirit of the age. But at the same time, you know, we had an exponential increase in the amount of information available to us, true, you know, scientific information, data. So, you know, post-truth arose during the kind of multiplication of data. We had both a kind of counter-enlightenment and a hyper-enlightenment at the same time. And I think, well, I think it's tempting to come up with a theory of history that says, rather than a spirit of the age, that every age actually is marked by polarities. There's always two things at odds with one another that mark an age, you know, peace and war, love and hate, poverty and affluence. I mean, poverty and affluence would be a strong one for these days, I think. Thanks very much for watching this video. It's very much appreciated. If you do like it, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel. Thank you.